Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto had expected fire, the divine wind, kamikaze, consuming him in a single, purifying flash. Instead, there was cold. Salt water flooded his lungs as the shattered cockpit of his Zero fighter plane plunged beneath the waves. Above him, the American destroyer he'd failed to sink loomed like a gray mountain. His last conscious thought was a prayer for forgiveness. He had survived when he should have died. When awareness returned, it came with pain. His chest burned. Someone was pressing down on him, forcing water from his lungs. Takeshi's eyes snapped open to see an American sailor, young, freckled, terrified, pumping his chest with desperate efficiency. Another sailor held his head, keeping his airway clear. They were shouting in English, words he didn't understand, but their hands moved with practiced urgency. "They're torturing me," Takeshi thought. The propaganda lectures had been clear. Americans were demons who delighted in prolonging the suffering of their enemies. This resuscitation was merely the beginning of a long humiliation. He tried to resist, to bite, to die with whatever dignity remained. But his body betrayed him, gasping for air, clinging to life. "Easy, easy, don't fight it." The sailor holding his head had kind eyes. This confused Takeshi more than cruelty would have. Within minutes, he was wrapped in a gray wool blanket on the destroyer's deck, surrounded by the same men whose ship he'd tried to destroy. They brought him hot coffee, that precious luxury he'd tasted only twice in his entire life. One sailor offered him a cigarette. Another checked his burns with gentle hands, applying some kind of salve that eased the fire in his skin. Takeshi sat rigid, waiting for the deception to end. Surely this kindness was theater, performed before the real torture began. He'd been taught that Americans were soft, corrupt, ruled by Jewish financiers and Negro savages, that their society was collapsing from within, rotted by democracy and individualism, that they treated prisoners like animals. But as the destroyer cut through the waves toward Hawaii, something stranger than torture happened. Nothing. The Americans simply ignored him. Sailors walked past without spitting on him. Officers discussed navigation without threatening him. A young ensign even smiled apologetically when bringing him a bowl of soup, thick with vegetables and actual chunks of meat. Takeshi stared at the bowl. His last meal in Japan had been a handful of rice and some pickled radish. "Eat," the ensign said, miming with his hands. "You need strength." For what? Takeshi wondered. What do they gain by feeding a failed kamikaze pilot? 3 days later, Takeshi arrived at a prisoner-of-war camp on the island of Oahu. He steeled himself as guards led him through the gates. Here, finally, the American mask would fall. Here, the beatings would begin. The camp sprawled across several acres, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But inside was something Takeshi couldn't reconcile with reality. Rows of wooden barracks, clean and well-maintained. Gardens where prisoners grew vegetables. A makeshift baseball diamond where Japanese soldiers played with a real leather ball. His assigned barracks had a concrete floor, bunk beds with actual mattresses, and windows with screens to keep out mosquitoes. There was a shower facility with hot water, a latrine that flushed, electric lights. Takeshi's own barracks in Japan, before his kamikaze assignment, had been worse than this. "You're Takeshi Yamamoto?" A Japanese-American interpreter approached, speaking in perfect Tokyo dialect. The man wore a U.S. Army uniform. This, too, was propaganda fodder back home. The Americans forced Japanese Americans into uniform, using them as slaves. But this man's uniform was pressed, his boots polished. He carried himself with quiet dignity. "I won't tell you anything," Takeshi said, his voice hoarse. The interpreter smiled sadly. "No one's asking. I'm just here to explain the camp rules. You'll receive 3 meals a day, medical care if needed, and a monthly ration of cigarettes and toiletries. If you want to work voluntarily, you can earn credits for additional privileges. There's a library, though most books are in English. Some men take correspondence courses. You're lying. I know it sounds impossible. Come, I'll show you." The mess hall served dinner at 1700 hours. Takeshi joined the line of prisoners, still expecting some cruel revelation. Perhaps the food was poisoned or drugged. But when he received his tray, he stood paralyzed. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, fresh oranges. His hands shook. In Japan, his mother was eating tree bark. His sister wrote letters about making soup from grass and insects. The emperor himself had called for endurance and sacrifice. And here, prisoners ate better than officers in the imperial army. Takeshi sat alone, unable to touch the food. Around him, Japanese soldiers ate quietly, some with obvious relish, others with the same stunned disbelief he felt. A prisoner at the next table noticed his untouched tray and spoke in Osaka dialect. "First day?" Takeshi nodded. "I know. It's hard to accept. I spent 2 weeks thinking it was poisoned." The man laughed bitterly. "But they have no reason to poison us. We're already defeated. This is just how they are." "How who is?" "Americans. They have so much that even their enemies eat well." That night, Takeshi couldn't sleep. He lay on his mattress, not bare boards or straw, and tried to reconcile 2 irreconcilable truths. If Americans lived this way, if they possessed this abundance, this power, this casual wealth, then Japan had never stood a chance. Every kamikaze pilot, every banzai charge, every death had been meaningless from the start. The propaganda had taught him that Americans were weak because of their comfort, that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage. But what he saw now was different. Americans were strong because of their system, their industry, their strange philosophy that even enemies deserved basic dignity. It was more crushing than any torture could have been. Weeks passed. Takeshi began to observe more carefully. He noticed that the American guards rotated shifts regularly. No one worked more than 8 hours. They had weekends off. They complained openly about their officers, about the food, about the war, without fear of punishment. One guard told him, through the interpreter, that he'd voted against Roosevelt in the last election. "You can vote against your leader?" Takeshi asked, stunned. "And admit it?" One guard told him, through the interpreter, that he'd voted against your leader. Takeshi asked, stunned. "And admit it?" "It's called democracy," the guard shrugged. "Sometimes your guy wins, sometimes he doesn't." This was another mind-bending revelation. In Japan, even thinking critically about the emperor was treason. Takeshi had seen men beaten for less. But here, common soldiers casually criticized their commander-in-chief and suffered no consequences. The camp library became Takeshi's refuge. With the interpreter's help, he began learning English by reading children's books. He discovered comic books, colorful, absurd stories about men who could fly or women who wielded magic lassos. The sheer frivolity of it astounded him. Americans had resources to waste on illustrated fantasies while fighting a two-front war across two oceans. One day, a Red Cross package arrived with his name on it. Inside, cigarettes, chocolate, soap, razor blades, and a small paperback book in Japanese. He stared at the chocolate bar for 10 minutes before unwrapping it. The taste exploded across his tongue, sweet, rich, impossibly decadent. He ate half and saved the rest, then felt ashamed. Saved it for what? Tomorrow would bring more food, more abundance. The psychological weight of that realization nearly broke him. The turning point came during a medical inspection. A doctor noticed scarring on Takeshi's back, old injuries from his basic training, where instructors had beaten recruits to strengthen their spirit. The American doctor, an older man with gray at his temples, examined the scars with a clinical eye. "These are from beatings," he said through the interpreter. "Military training?" Takeshi nodded, expecting mockery or disgust. Instead, the doctor's face softened with something like sadness. "That's not training," he said quietly. "That's abuse. No one should treat soldiers that way." "It made us strong," Takeshi replied automatically, the words hollow even to his own ears. "Did it?" The doctor held his gaze. "Or did it just make you afraid?" The question haunted Takeshi for days. He began reviewing his life through this new lens. The beatings, the starvation rations, the suicide missions. Were these signs of strength or desperation? The Emperor's divine mandate, the promise of spiritual victory over material weakness, were these truths or lies told by desperate men sending boys to die? He thought about the American sailors who'd pulled him from the water. They hadn't hesitated. They'd risked their lives, not for honor or glory or orders, but because it was simply what they did. It was normal to save a drowning enemy. Their humanity wasn't a weakness to overcome. It was foundational to who they were. Takeshi finally understood why Japan was losing. It wasn't superior American technology or resources, though those mattered. It was something deeper, a society that valued individual human life, even enemy life, had created citizens who could build, innovate, and sacrifice without being broken first. Americans didn't need to be beaten into obedience because their system earned their loyalty through opportunity and fairness. Imperfect fairness, the black soldiers in segregated units reminded him, but fairness nonetheless. One evening, Takeshi sat in the camp's recreation area, watching American guards play cards with Japanese prisoners. They laughed together over a shared joke, communicated through gestures and broken phrases. An older prisoner, a former colonel, played a harmonica, while a young American private tapped his foot to the rhythm. The interpreter sat down beside Takeshi. "You're thinking very hard." "I'm trying to understand," Takeshi admitted. "How does a nation this casual about everything defeat an empire built on discipline and sacrifice?" The interpreter considered this. Maybe that's exactly why. They don't need to be desperate. They can afford to be kind. But we were told. I know what you were told. I heard the same propaganda before the war, back when I was in Japan visiting relatives. America was supposed to be weak, divided, corrupted by democracy and diversity. But Takeshi-san, look around. Does this look like weakness? It didn't. It looked like strength so complete, so overwhelming, that it could afford generosity even toward enemies. It looked like a civilization that had solved problems Japan didn't even know how to articulate. That night, Takeshi wrote his first letter home. He told his mother he was alive and well treated. He didn't mention the food, the medical care, or the strange kindness of his captors. Some truths were too painful to share, too dangerous to put in writing. But he ended with a line that felt like both confession and prophecy. I have seen things here that I cannot explain. The world is not what we were told. Years later, long after the war ended and Takeshi returned to a Japan transformed by occupation and reconstruction, he would keep one item from his time as a prisoner, a chocolate bar wrapper. He never ate that saved half. It melted in the Hawaiian heat. But he kept the wrapper as a reminder of the day his certainty died, the day he learned that the greatest shock of war wasn't violence or death, but discovering that your enemy's ordinary kindness exceeded your nation's extraordinary promises. The water that should have been his grave had instead baptized him into a new understanding. That strength and compassion weren't opposites, that abundance could coexist with discipline, and that the most devastating weapon in war might simply be the truth.